Hi, Stephen here for the Idiot Quilter, and here's another interview in my series of interviews with subscribers. Enjoy! Okay, so today on the Idiot Quilter Presents, I have someone that I know and somebody that my husband works with because this is Brendan and he teaches online classes in sewing and so much more. We're going to find out a whole lot of other things about him as well as we go through. But first of all, let's just start with your name, first and last name, and where you're located in general.
My name is Brendan Corcoran, and I'm in Durham, which is Southern Ontario in Canada.
Yeah, in Ontario, where we are. Okay, so that's great. So let's jump right into this. Now, many of my viewers are probably expecting you to be a quilter, but you are not a quilter.
Oh,
You are a garment sewer.
correct.
And what would you call yourself? Would you call yourself a sewer? Would you call yourself a tailor, a fashionista, a fashion designer?
It's a good question because I think to myself when people ask me what's your hobby, and so I think the current term now is a sewist, as opposed to a sewer, and that can be male, female. So that's kind of cool. I wouldn't say a fashionista. I certainly just. It's a hobby and it's something that I love so much that I consider myself just a sewist, and I like to be participating with other sewists that share the same passion.
Okay, I think that's interesting. I've learned something because I would have immediately said sewer, but I have heard the term sewist, and yeah, I think it's more appropriate in the 21st century because it is non-gender based.
Right.
And there are a lot of men. Well, there's always been a lot of men, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But there's always been a lot of men who have been in the tailoring kind of thing.
That's a good point. Yes,
yeah.
I've often thought, do I call myself a tailor? And I always associate that with somebody who's one of these really high-end couture type of guys that are doing suits that are made to measure and so precise. And I don't consider my skills good enough to be called a tailor. But that's what I'm doing.
You're darn close if you're not there already, I would say, from what I've seen. But okay, so as a sewist, how did you get started in sewing? Have you always been doing this, or is this something recent?
That's such a fun question because when I was thinking about it, I actually got started because of you.
Oh, for me. Oh,
believe it or not. Yeah, well, no. So what happened was I was really interested in making costumes for Halloween parties, and I would put things together based on materials that I could gather and glue or stick or whatever to make costumes, and that was really fun. And so there was one night, one particular Halloween dance, and you and Walter were there, and you had these really cool costumes, but clearly they were made out of fabric, and clearly they were sewn. And I was commenting on them, and I remember thinking, I would love to make my own costumes like at that level. And that's when you said, well, if you want to start sewing, and you pointed me in the direction of the Ultimate Sewing Center, and you said, go see Shirley, she'll take care of you. And so I did. And that is really what got me started. And that's only been 2 years ago. But at the end of the day, I went and I saw Shirley. She set me up with a machine, and then I started taking the courses that they offer. And the rest, as they say, is history. But it was your recommendation to say that's where you go. That's the resource that was local that we could tap into, and I just never turned back.
Right, and yeah, and you've in the 2 years you've been doing this, it's incredible the progress that you've made. I mean, you've gone so way beyond what Walter and I used to create in such a short time, and that kind of thing. And we were not, and it wasn't me making costumes. It was Walter that was doing all of that, and now he's taking classes from you. So yeah, full circle here. So did anyone influence you in your family? Did you come from did your parents, anybody in your family sew or anything like that?
So yes, my mother sewed. I think all of our moms sewed. She still has her old Singer. I don't even know what year it is, but the ones that fold down. It's a piece of furniture. It's not just a machine. Yep. And she still has it. And I one day will probably take it from her. I just don't have room now. But And so I was always impressed at the fact that she wasn't a big sewer, but every once in a while the fit would hit and she would pull out a pattern and make a dress in like 2 days.
Mm.
And I was always impressed by that. And I thought the machine was kind of cool, how she'd wind a bobbin or how she'd make the thing go backwards and stuff like that. But I never knew how to thread a sewing machine. But the other side of that was at about 7, there was one of our neighbors. She came over to look after us while my parents were on a business trip, and she taught me how to knit. And I did a lot of knitting since about grade 2. And at that time, of course, you make headbands and you make mittens and you make the real simple things. But over time, especially when I got to university, I started making sweaters. And what's really cool about that is that the pattern pieces of a sweater are very similar to pattern pieces of a shirt or things that you would do in sewing. So even though I didn't have the skills, I had the notion of how the pieces would piece together and come together. And that was from a very young age.
Well, I remember you talking before you got into sewing about your knitting and everything like that. And I saw some of your creations and they were phenomenal as well. Now, are you still knitting?
No, it's funny because I think my first real sewing project was to make a knitting bag. It's really funny. So, the bag would have all the million pockets for all the different equipment and supplies and notions. And it's just, knitting is what happened is that I got old and impatient because it takes about, for the sweaters that I was making, it would take 3 or 4 months to get a sweater together. And I wanted to exercise my creative side and start developing patterns, but it took so long to see the results of your creation that I was getting frustrated and just wasn't getting satisfied. Whereas with sewing, it's so great because I can, within a week, usually about a week, I can see, oh, that worked out, or, oh, that doesn't look so great. But you get that turnaround very quickly and you can move on to the next creative piece.
Yeah, true. And I don't know now, I may be in hot water here with other people who knit, and there's a lot of knitters on YouTube. And there's several that I follow, even though I do not knit. But to me, knitting is limited in the sense that, you make a sweater, you make a scarf, you make mittens, you make socks and a toque or something like that. Whereas when you sew, to me, there's so much more you can do, even within the line of garments as well, the different styles and the different things. I don't know, but I am sure there are knitters out there that would debate with me, and I don't want to create controversy over that. I'm not saying everything has its place.
At some point, I got a book. I mean, I've got a million knitting patterns, if you can imagine, but I have a book that just does knitting, like bags, purses that you can knit, which you would kind of think, well, that's not normally what you would think of. And certainly in the knitting world, there are lots of other things, but I think you're right. I don't think there is the breadth of the possibilities that you can do in the sewing world.
Yeah, but we won't get too deep into that because there may be some people maybe a little offended by that. So I don't want to do that. Sure. What's your favorite creation to date and why?
So I have 2 actually. Okay. So one of them, and do you want to see a picture of it?
Oh yeah, sure.
Show you. So it was this, it's kind of like an overshirt. It's kind of, or a coat.
That's cool.
And it's got a really, really soft velour. But what I loved about this was the inside is this Sherpa lining.
Oh yeah.
And so it's really, really cozy for the winter. But what I liked so much about this was I had the fabric and I saw a picture on the internet and somebody said, oh, I would love to see if I could find a pattern like this. And I just knocked it off.
Well, so you didn't use a pattern?
I did. I used a block to get the base front pieces, right, but the rest I created myself. So, the block pattern actually has a facing inside, and I took the facing out, created the button bands, or it would have a hem. And I said, well, I don't want a hem. I want to do a facing instead. And so I really kind of took that block pattern and really created this myself. And it was such a pleasant experience because it turned out.
I was going to say, so when are you going to teach Walter how to make one of those?
Yeah.
I like that.
Well, and so the other thing was, of course, the learning experience, because it was the first time I'd actually worked with a Sherpa.
Yeah.
And this Sherpa was a whole different challenge, especially when you're trying to put in the welts for a pocket. So you've got to get very fine and detailed, but you've got all that Sherpa lining. It's very, very difficult. And so I found myself shaving the inside of the fabric in the areas that I was going to put the seam, but it worked out and turned out to be, and then the other thing is that Sherpa lining is not as easy to find.
No, I was going to say probably not
Yeah.
with that. Now, you said there was another thing.
So the other thing, and you might recognize this was a coat that we did.
Oh, yes.
And I did this in my class. And the reason I like this one so much is because all the students, I had done this as a pattern test for one of the pattern companies that I do tests for. And of course, when you do a pattern test, they want you to follow the pattern, which is fine. But the actual pattern was very, very different in terms of it didn't have this flap or it didn't have this. And so all the students modified, or they asked us to modify. So this pattern used to have, like, it called for a drawstring on the outside. And everybody said, well, I'd like to see the drawstring on the inside, which is what we did. And then it also calls for a lining, but the pattern didn't call for lining the sleeves. And I said, well, why don't we add that? And then the pattern didn't call for these kind of wallet pockets on the inside. So we added that. And so what I like so much about this is, again, I was able to make all those modifications and still make it work, because they were not easy. But of course, I had to figure it out to be able to teach it. But so as it turned out, it turned out to be probably my favorite coat now, for all those reasons.
I know Walter's turned out pretty nice too with it as well. But okay, so here you are, 2 years sewing from scratch. Okay. Now you are taking patterns, you're using them as a base, but you're altering them. You're working with fabrics that are difficult fabrics probably to work with. So did you take any classes to learn how to do this?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. So again, when we first started, we were when I say we, it's because Michael is my partner, and Michael started taking classes with me. So we were there together when we bought our first machine, and we went and literally took a beginner sewing class. They teach you how to thread the machine, how to wind a bobbin, how to do some straight seams. But it was amazing because that class in 6 weeks, I guess, 2 hours per class or 2.5. And in 6 classes, we had learned how to sew the seams, how to create a lining, because we did those little, the little bags, that the thread catchers. So you had to do a lining with that. They taught us how to read a pattern. They taught us how to cut the pattern out and cut the fabric or lay it out. Even Eleanor taught us how to line up your fabric in such a way that the grain line stays parallel and so that you're cutting properly. And so that first class was so basic, but so critical, created the foundation that everything comes from there. I took a few more classes with another store or another company in their area. They didn't turn out to be so good. So I ended up running to YouTube a lot of times to solve some of my problems. And then I've also taken some workshops with my best friend, or my best sewing guru, Ron Collins. And that's where I've learned so much.
Yeah, and Ron Collins is a guru in the garment sewing. I've met Ron before too. I've seen his creations and whatnot. And just, this is a little aside, you're running a series of classes with him very soon, are you not?
That's correct. So it's interesting because Ron does various types of classes. He would do things at the creative show in Toronto where he just does like a 2-hour tutorial in front of a big crowd. Of course, these don't happen because of the pandemic anymore. He also does, that's like a 2-hour intense kind of, here's a real neat technique. Or there's the 3-day retreats where you go away for 3 days and every day you're working with Ron, and there's usually about 6 or 8 other people there, and you bring a pattern that you want to work on, and he helps you modify, he helps you with any of the challenges that you might have, and you walk away with a pattern that's going to fit you perfectly. So those 3-day retreats are very intense, and I love them. And but the problem is that they're a financial commitment. And there are enough people that don't want to kind of, first of all, 3 days is a long time, and to come up with, $400 to $500 to go and spend 3 days sewing. So, Ron stopped. He was initially coming to Oshawa, the area where we are, and he was doing 1 day retreats, 1 day workshops or 3 day retreats, but then he stopped doing them because it was just not financially feasible. Particularly at the facility where you and I have taken our first lessons, and they had to rent a separate facility. So anyway, long story short, I was traveling out to Guelph, which is about an hour and a half to 2 hours, depending on traffic, to do these retreats whenever they would come up. So I'm really excited because next week I get to do another one.
Yeah.
So I'm going to spend 3 days in Guelph, and I can't wait. And Ron and I, we message back and forth all the time. But as part of that, last year, I did a retreat with him, and he said, well, we should think about maybe trying to arrange something in Oshawa for your students. And so that's how that started. And when I was able to get really access to the location where we're going and at really, really good cost, then it did become financially feasible. And we created kind of 3 1-day retreat or 1-day workshops. And the purpose for that is that people can sign up for 1, they can sign up for 2, or they can do all 3. That allows people the flexibility to put as much commitment into it as they want. So we started that, and it was really, really nice because, as soon as we started reaching out to our networks, it started to spread. And right now we're at capacity, and I have a waiting list. So
that's great.
Yeah, so it's turned out really, really well. And I started getting excited because Ron pre-shipped all the kits that he uses. They're sitting in my other part of the room. So we're ready to go. And I'm really excited for that.
Well, I know Walter's excited about it. And everything. So it sounds great. So you said in another part of your room. So what I'm seeing right now, I'm assuming that is your sewing room. And from there, you teach your classes and do all of your work and everything like that. So was that always a room that you had for working in, or is that something you've created now out of, well, probably necessity? And I see all the fabric. So
yeah, that's a good question. The room was kind of storage at one point. So, and at one side over here, we've got a big giant freezer and our kind of drink fridge. But that's just because it was in storage and we don't have anywhere else to put that. But so as I started sewing, I would create, more space, or, the big thing was getting a cutting table, right? Because you want a big cutting space. Right. And then, of course, the table for where the sewing machine goes. And then it evolved as I started teaching, because, and the reason I started teaching was because of the pandemic, and we were teaching online. So now I have it built in such a way where I've got cameras in different spots so that I can switch the cameras depending on what part of the class we're teaching. So yes, it's built out of necessity, and I'd love if it was twice the size that it is.
We'd all want our work areas to be twice the size, no matter what.
That's sure.
True. So,
for sure.
So with your sewing area, now something I was going to ask you too is, how do you describe yourself as a sewist? What I mean by that, how would you characterize your style?
Good question. I'm like a traditional sewist on steroids. I will stay with like mainstream patterns, mainstream styles and cuts, but that's where I will then take them and embellish them. So I'm not going to create garments that are way out there and different, at least not yet, that are like, I'm going to start with a base pattern. And, with men's clothes, you've got shirts, you've got sweaters, you've got jackets and pants. There's not really a whole lot different from that. And I wouldn't imagine, like, I'm not going to be on Project Runway doing all these really crazy, really wild creations. So I'll start with the basics, but I also, while I don't want to, quote, change the world, I want to stand out in a crowd. So the fabrics or the way I embellish will very clearly identify that, oh, that's very unique, or people will know that, oh, you can't buy that off a shelf. So that's kind of how I describe myself. And people know, I love color blocking. I love using really bold colors. I love, something that's going to be unique,
Yeah.
where
I would say that's for sure. That's definitely your style, because I've seen pictures of some of your creations and things. And yes, and they may scare off some men, but when you go into a store to buy yourself a shirt or a pair of pants, really, there's not that much to pick from.
yeah,
And that's one thing, like with Walter and the shirts he's made and things like that. I mean, I've got a whole wardrobe now of new shirts that I love, because I can't get those kind of shirts in those fabrics in a regular store. And some people think, if you sew a shirt or something, well, you're doing that because it's less expensive than what's in the store. Well, far from it. It's probably going to cost you more, but it's unique, and
so
fits
to
your style.
expand on that, you and Walter were very, very helpful for me, because part of that, adding the uniqueness factor, embellishment factor, was that I invested in an embroidery machine. And you guys have been extremely helpful in helping me kind of expand and explore into that world. And to the point where, now if I have the opportunity to put embroidery on the garment somehow, I will. So
Yeah.
I made a pair of overalls that I took some canvas and I dyed it, and it's kind of a fuchsia or a really hot pink. And I put a big flamingo on the front that was through the embroidery machine. And yeah, a lot of people would shy away from that because, one, it's pink, two, it's very bold. But I was wearing it just last week, and a woman came up to me and she just went, "I love everything about this." So it's that kind of statement piece that I like to do.
Yeah, and they definitely do say something. There's no two ways about it.
For sure.
But it's great, because why, women for years have been able to have very interesting clothing, many choices. And men, it's either a shirt's either, if it's a dress shirt, it's got stripes, or it's plain, it's this color or it's that color. And you've broken way out of that box. And I think it is time for that, men shouldn't be afraid of color or pattern.
For sure.
So my next question for you then is, do you have a favorite tool and or technique?
Well, that's a good question. I would say, in terms of not really a tool, but if there was one thing that I would probably curl up in the fetal position and die if I couldn't use, and that would be my good old friend Steamacine. I don't know if you've heard Walter talk about it, but It's so funny because all my students, they laugh because I literally buy this by the case, and it is probably the lifesaver. And when people say, well, you're so precise, the precision and the accuracy or the detail is so amazing. And that's because of Steamacine. And it's such a neat tool because it helps you kind of put things in place before you sew it. And then things won't move. And you can get that accuracy and the precision. And it also helps to do things. So for example, putting in a front zipper on a pair of pants. I mean, they always say, well, you could baste it in. Well, don't baste it. Use Steamacine. It takes half the time and it works better.
And you don't have to pull out stitches afterwards.
That's right. That's probably one of my biggest ones. But, in terms of tools, like I think anything that helps make the process better. So I started making some bags. I joined a sewing group and we made these kind of pleather bags, and I have 2 daughters and they're getting them for Christmas. And so I bought a rivet press because I've been, you put rivets into jeans or into a jean jacket and you've got to bang them through with a hammer. And I find it very frustrating. And invariably I get them crooked and bent and whatever. So the rivet press was quite expensive, but worth every cent. So that's another tool. Again, it just solves the problem. Yeah, so, and sewing is really cool because there are a lot that do that, right?
Yeah. Well, you must have influenced Walter on that because he just bought one too. Yeah, he hasn't. I don't think it's arrived yet, but he's ordered one as well for the same reasons as you're saying too. So while we're talking about tools and that, now you said you have a sewing machine and you have an embroidery machine. So I think you have a serger as well, if I'm correct about that. So what kind of sewing machine do you have? What kind of embroidery machine do you have? And what kind of serger do you have?
So they're all Janomes, and that's primarily because the shop that we shop in is primarily a Janome dealer. It was really funny because I was thinking about upgrading my machine, and I wouldn't get rid of I love my machine. It's the Janome S5.
Yep.
And I just love it. There are some things that I'd like to be able to do and maybe upgrade someday, but I was also, there's a lot of people that I communicate with that use Bernina, and I've heard that Bernina is kind of like a high-end machine, and I thought maybe I should go and get a Bernina machine. And a friend of mine said, Janome can hold a candle to Bernina. There's nothing wrong with your Janome, but if you all of a sudden you want to buy a new machine, I'd very, very strongly recommend you stay with the same brand, because then your accessories and your notion, all those things are interchangeable, which was probably the best piece of advice that he gave me. So the serger is the Air Threader by Janome. Absolutely love it. And the embroidery machine is the not the 550. I think Walter has the 550. I have the 500. So yeah. So they're all Janomes, and I just love them. As I say, maybe one day I will go up to the S9 on the Janome machines, but we'll see. Obviously, it depends on the money.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Well, I collect machines like women collect shoes. But we have a lot of machines in this house, yes, but mine are all Janome too. But that was simply because we had a Janome dealer, a good Janome dealer, Shirley at Ultimate Sewing, as we've already mentioned before. And yeah, I mean, I have thought about Bernina too. I've heard lots of good things about them, but it's not as convenient in terms of picking one up and having, after sales service, which is really important. And it's whatever you get used to as well, I think. So yeah, I think I'm pretty much a Janome person for life.
So I did earlier this year, I kind of jumped off under the counsel of my dear friend Ron. I bought myself a Sashiko machine. And it's made by Baby Lock, because Janome doesn't make one.
Right.
But this was a real luxury, or how shall I say, you don't need a Sashiko machine, but if you have one, it's a really neat tool, because it only does one kind of stitch. And even learning how to use it it's a finicky thing. And because it doesn't, if you can imagine a machine that has a needle, but has no thread coming from the top, just a bobbin.
Yeah.
And the needle goes down and picks up the bobbin thread, and it's almost like it's crocheting across the top of the garment. A lot of quilters apparently use the Sashiko machine.
Yeah, there is actually on my embroidery machine, there is a series on there of those stitches as well. It doesn't do it in the way that a real Sashiko machine would do it, but I have not really used it at all. So that brings me to the question then, what do you use it for? Is it for decorative elements on garments?
Most of the time, yes. One of the things that I did earlier this year as well, I started working with a farm that's east of the city. They were it's an alpaca farm, and they have a little kind of gift shop and wanted to expand their offering. So of course, alpaca yarn, you think knitting and wool and that sort of thing. But they also wanted to start creating garments where the alpaca wool is used as an insulator. Because apparently, I didn't know this, but apparently it's 7 times warmer than lamb's wool.
Oh.
So I've been out there. They asked me to design a vest that could be worn in the winter, that obviously would have the lining that is got that alpaca lining in it. So what I did with my Sashiko machine was I quilted the whole garment with the machine, which gave it a look that again is quite unique, because normally when you quilt, you would use your walking foot and you're just going to get a seam across. Yeah. Well, of course, you can create gaps in your Sashiko stitching, and it accomplished the same thing in terms of creating that quilting factor, but then also it looks different because it's the Sashiko.
Yeah.
So that's where, I would use that. If I'm going to quilt another coat or do that sort of thing, I would look to that machine.
Yeah, give it a very unique look, something that you just don't see every day.
Exactly.
With that too. So that brings me to, if you had all the money in the world, is there a piece of equipment you would want to invest in?
Well, actually, there's one that I'm I don't need all the money in the world. I just need a little bit of encouragement. And that is, have you heard about the reliable ironing machines?
Yes.
So it's the reliable 5000, where it's got a big tank on the side and it doesn't turn off and you get pressurized steam for about 4 hours.
Yeah.
So it's on my list of things to get.
Yeah.
Because in my view, the difference between a good sewist and a poor sewist is all in the pressing.
Yep.
And so, yeah, I'd like to get I've got one of those oleo machines. Aliso or whatever. Anyway, I have a lot of trouble with it and I'm going to have to get a new machine. So I'm trying to debate on whether I bite the bullet and drop the kind of cash to get one of these other machines.
Yeah. Well, I have one sort of like that. Mine's a Rowenta tank machine.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That I bought. And I had an Aliso too. I bought it because it pops. I was completely fascinated by that. You can sit it down flat on the thing. It would raise up and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I had 2 of them. My first one burned out in a year. It just didn't pop anymore. Okay. And now the company did replace it. They were great. Their customer service is very good. But I was constantly having to fill it. So I have a tank machine now because even for us as quilters too, pressing is very, very important as well. So you won't regret investing in one of those types of irons, I'm sure.
So apparently they have also an ironing board that you can extend. So you can have like 6 or 8 feet of ironing space. So I want to look into that as well.
I didn't know about that.
And that's again, when I see Ron next week, he's the one who told me about it. And I'm going to look into it. I believe the company is reliable. And in fact, they're in Newmarket here in Ontario. And,
they've been around for a long time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to look into that.
About them.
But ultimately, I had a very dear friend that ran a sweatshop in downtown Toronto. And he had one of these cutting layout tables that's like a mile long.
Yeah.
If I had my druthers, I'd have a room that was big enough to have one of those tables.
Yeah, we don't have houses big enough. We have to put on additions. I know. I just changed my whole sewing room into a totally different room as well. I don't know if Walter told you about that.
I was going to say, you bought the long arm, didn't you?
Yeah, it comes tomorrow.
Oh my God, that's exciting.
Yeah, if Walter and I don't kill each other in the process of trying to assemble it. But everybody says it's easy. It takes you about 3 hours of your life that you'll never get back again. But yeah, so now I do have a much bigger sewing room, but that's a story for another day, and it's not about me, it's about you. So moving on here, have you ever belonged then? Now you have your class, which is an online group, but I think you mentioned there was another group that you belong to. I don't know if it's online or something like that.
Sure. So in fact, in the sewing community, there are a number of different groups. And I think it depends on the specific topic at hand. So for example, the sashiko machine that I bought, there's actually a group just for sashiko owners. So that if you have challenges or issues, and it's been incredibly valuable, because when I was having trouble threading it at one point, I went there and somebody had given me the link to somebody who teaches this stuff. And I followed a couple of YouTube videos, bang, the problem was solved. In fact, it's out of that group that I actually found my machine. Somebody wanted to sell it. And so that was brilliant. There's also one of the new trends coming out, particularly in the garment side, is instead of printing your pattern, you project using projectors onto your sewing table. And I have a couple of my students have done that and they love it. Apparently the time to set it up and calibrate to make sure that the right size that's coming down onto your table is correct is quite extensive, but that once it's done, it's done. So I've toyed with that. I've been with that projector sewing group. I haven't kind of embarked on that road yet. But even then, like there's some groups that are just dedicated for knit fabrics, or there's some groups that are just dedicated for menswear. And so I have a whole myriad of them that, and they come up through Facebook and all that sort of stuff and you always get, sometimes you scroll by, right? Because it doesn't interest you. And sometimes it's, wow, you learn a lot of really cool stuff, or you get inspired.
Yeah.
because some people put up pictures of stuff that they've made, and I've kind of gone, I really like that idea, or I do, and that's very inspiring.
Yeah, I find that YouTube and Facebook are both valuable sources of information for all of this. And so actually that takes me to another question too. I might as well ask this now because we're kind of on that. Um, do you have any, now you mentioned Ron Collins as well, but do you have any favorite sources that you turn to time and time again for information or inspiration?
So it's funny that it's, you know, Ron is probably more about information. Because I can email him and say, hey, I'm struggling with this, and he kind of gets back to me. But in terms of inspiration, so there's a men's group. It's called So Manly on
Yes,
Facebook.
I know it.
It's moderated by Julian Collins,
Oh,
who's in no way related to Ron Collins or anything.
just going to say, brother, no.
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 And Julian is very inspirational. He's got a lot of really cool ideas. And dare I say, I have to be careful how I say this. In the men's sewing world, one of the things that I discovered is that the men from the Caribbean or that region have a lot more sewing as part of their basic skill set. Mm. So when I just changing gears slightly, I was working out at a gym and I was working with a trainer, and I started sewing, and I wore an outfit that I had worn or made. And he said, oh my God, I've got to get my sewing machine out and start sewing again. And I thought, oh, so you sew? He says, every guy from the Caribbean sews. But the guys from the Caribbean sew with bold colors. They have lots. And so this is Julian Collins. He's got these really, really cool colors and something that really inspires me. And then the other group that I belong to is called Dope Men Sew. And this is moderated by a fellow by the name of Norris Ford. And he is married to Mimi G, who has a lot of patterns with simplicity.
Oh, okay.
And he does a lot of his own designs. I think they're with So Def. So I've done a couple of his patterns, but he's got that whole Facebook group. And a lot of people, again, are posting in there. And he's quite inspirational as well.
Well, I didn't realize there was that many different groups out there, and especially the specialization of the groups. Like you're saying, there's groups out there that just work with a certain type of fabric and things like that. So yeah, because in the quilting world, there's lots of groups too, but it's quilting. Yeah, like it's, you know, it's patterns.
Let me ask you a question. Let me ask this question. Like in the quilting world, you kind of walk into Fabricland or you walk into a fabric store and they have a section called quilting cotton.
Yeah.
So, you know, the one eye opener for me in the sewing world very early on was the variety of fabric choices and the learning curve associated with each different fabric choice. Now, in the quilting world, do you have that same? Do you see as much variation in the fabrics that you're using?
In pattern and in color, yes, but not in what it's made of. It's made from 100% quilting cotton. So you don't have that problem. Now you can go into flannel, and some people do. And there are a couple of other things that people like minky, which is kind of like what you were showing in that jacket that you had lined with. But really not that many differences. But where the differences come and the uniqueness come are in the pattern designs that people put together. And then, of course, you've got people who go outside of the box and do modern quilting and do art quilts as well. So there is a whole different area in that as well. And I've only touched on those areas a little bit in my career, but I'm leaning more and more towards the art quilts, but that comes from my mixed media background, why I like doing those kind of things. But no, we don't have the variety of types of fabrics. We just have the variety in the colors and in the prints and that kind of thing. And there's like thousands of those for it. So if you're afraid of color, or if you're afraid you're going to screw up when you're picking colors, that is something you have to break out of when you're quilting. And so many people are afraid they're going to pick the wrong color combination. It's just color. You can do it. Yeah. So speaking of all of this kind of stuff, So where do you get your supplies and your materials? Do you actually go to fabric stores a lot, or do you spend more time buying online?
It's a bit of both. Of course, the pandemic forced us to do a lot of online buying, and you had to kind of bite the bullet and not being able to touch and feel the fabric. I mean, that's a tough one. But then you would also find that certain stores or certain online shops had fantastic quality regardless, so you knew you could trust them. Whereas others, you were like, "Geez, I don't know if I'd buy from them again." And
Right.
that's just the nature of the beast if you're buying online. I do, if I'm buying notions, like if I'm buying Steam a Seam, then I'll just go on to Amazon because I know it's a standard product with a standard brand and I know the price of it, and I can get it usually with same day delivery or next day delivery. So that's really, really convenient.
Yeah.
So what's really interesting is that depending on what you need, you have specialty stores. So
Right.
just like there's specialty groups, like if I was to buy knit fabric, for example, I'm going to go to a store. It's called loiseau.com in Calgary, or there's Water Tower Textiles here in Ontario. And those two are both really, really good for good quality knit fabrics. Actually, Loiseau, I was able to buy from them a swatch card that had all of the colors that you could possibly get. And you can get it in your rib knit, your regular jersey knit, your French terry, or your sweatshirt fabric, all in the same colors. So very often you're making a garment and you want to put a ribbing around the bottom and you want the color to match. Well, having this chart and it's got a little square piece of the fabric, so I'm not looking at a screen trying to guess, well, what really is that? Is that maroon, burgundy, wine? So this has got the actual fabric pieces, and I can say, okay, if I need to buy that, I can go straight online.
Now,
but again, that's knit fabrics.
I know a lot of quilters put up a lot of resistance to buying online because they say they want to feel the fabric. I am not one of those. I've had very good luck buying through the pandemic, buying my fabrics online, mainly because as long as it says it's 100% quilting cotton and it's by a brand name company, I know what the quality is going to be like. But there's those purists out there that want to feel the fabric. Now, do you feel that you really need to feel the fabric? It sounds to me like, no, you can do it online.
As I'm now, one of the other things is when you're looking through the description of a fabric, you can, and again, if you've got a reputable shop, so one of the ones that Walter and I both bought that same fabric for that utility jacket. It's actually in Eastern Ontario, close to Cornwall, but it's called Simplify Fabric. And I know that when they get stuff in, it's going to be top quality. So there's no concern there. But then it's also understanding when it talks about the weight. Because sometimes if you buy a 5-ounce denim and you want to use that for a pair of pants or a jacket, forget it. It's great for a shirt because it's obviously a different weight. So learning what weights are common for what types of garment, that's really, really helpful too. So I don't actually have to feel it. Again, having that reputation, there's Blackbird Fabrics in BC that are brilliant. Like their stuff is absolutely gorgeous. And so I will turn to them. If I'm making a really, really a special garment, and I want to pay the money for the fabric, then I go to these kind of stores.
Yeah.
There's one here in Toronto too, Sultan's Fine Fabrics. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. They're over by Yorkdale.
Oh, okay.
And they've got some cashmere for $175 a meter.
Whoa. Oh, so you don't want to waste that, do you? You don't want to make a mistake with something like that.
Oh, exactly.
So, yeah. Okay. So, there was something I was going to ask you when you just talked about the fabrics and getting them where you get them, and now it went right out of my head. Oh, I was going to say, oh yeah, you were talking about the weight of fabric, which is something as a quilter I don't have to worry about.
Exactly.
For us, the only weight we worry about is the weight of the thread.
Sure.
And how that is for that kind of thing. So yeah, that's one thing we don't have to worry about. The weight's all the same on the fabric. So here's a question for you. And I ask this because coming from a crafter's background and then moving into quilting, I found when I was in the crafting community and I walked into a store back in the day when there were lots of scrapbook stores and that kind of thing, I would get attitude because I was a male in this. Now, in quilting stores, however, I have found the exact opposite. I only in one case, and that was only for a couple of seconds, did I find that there was some prejudice where they were looking around saying, well, where's your wife? Where's the woman you've come in with? Are you buying something for a female here? And no, I'm a quilter. But I've never had that kind of thing. Have you ever run into, when you go into fabric stores, have you ever run into anything that's basically a form of discrimination because you're a male in what is really, well, it's changing and changing rapidly, but more considered a traditional female domain?
So yes, there's no question. And it's really funny because I almost play with it because as soon as you walk in the store, I can tell if they have a sense of, oh, here's some guy who doesn't know what he's doing and he's just, trying to buy fabric. And so sometimes I kind of let it go, and I won't demonstrate any of my knowledge just to see how bad they will be about it. And I kind of find it humor.
Oh, you tease you.
And other times, sometimes women can be almost arrogant about, well, there's no way you can know. And usually in those situations, I get my back up, and I don't get mean or rude, but I start demonstrating my level of knowledge. But what usually happens, and what I find actually the opposite, is that women, once I do demonstrate a little bit of knowledge, they actually they shine to me. And it's like, oh my God, it's a guy who sews. And they want to see the stuff that I've made. They want me to bring back stuff to show, oh, what are you going to make with this? Or what are you going to make with that? And they get excited. So it's almost the opposite effect. And that's fun.
It's training. It's training. We just have to show them that, yes, we can do this too. I suppose from a woman's, exactly. I suppose a woman's attitude towards that is, well, we've been suffering with this kind of discrimination for years from men in stuff. So it's your turn. So whatever. But we're not going to get in a whole discussion of, that kind of thing, because I have to realize that a lot of my viewers are female and I'll hear about it. Okay, so we're not going to go into that whatsoever. Fair enough. Do you have any challenges or goals for the future in terms of projects you might want to do?
Yes. Yeah, in fact, so I mentioned earlier that I'm going on this 3-day retreat next week. And my daughter had announced her engagement around Christmas, but she's getting married next summer. So I want to make my whole I'm going to make a suit. So a 3-piece suit all out of the fabric. So that's my kind of challenge for next week with Ron. I obviously won't get it done, but the idea is to show up with the jacket, the vest, and the pants in a muslin form, so that we can then modify the pattern so that I can take away and I actually have the fabric already for the suit. So yeah, that's my big, I'm working on a jacket. Making a men's jacket is probably my biggest challenge.
Yeah, I was going to say, from what I've heard, making men's jackets or men's suits is very difficult.
There's a lot of steps and a lot of pieces that I've learned from Ron. I was so lucky because, and just mentioned, I was on one of those retreats and Ron said to me, he said, do you have a DVD player? And he handed me this, 4-box set or 4-disc set of all his tailoring to make a suit. And he just said, well, here, take this. The thing's regular $75 in it. And I was like, oh, and so I use this quite extensively as I was just working on the jacket, the muslin, right? But it's absolutely amazing. The stuff that goes inside to make a men's blazer you would have no idea from.
And I wouldn't.
So it's quite amazing. It's really quite amazing. So I'm learning that step right now, and so I'm looking forward to working with him next week and kind of getting the pattern kind of fitting me properly, and then I'll go away and the other thing which I like so much about it is, well, She's not getting married till next summer, so I've got months to do
That
this.
time, but it'll
So
go
I'm not-
faster than you think, right?
well,
So
it will for sure.
yeah,
For sure.
yeah. So I have absolutely no desire to sew garments. I'm a quilter. Walter tried quilting, did a brilliant job on it. I mean, his first project was a stained glass quilt, which I hadn't even done one of those yet. But he wasn't his cup of tea. His cup of tea is to do the garment sewing like you. Do you have any desire to quilt?
No.
And why is that? Why is that?
So
Well, before you answer that, I'll tell you why I have no desire to garment sew. The reason being is, to me, garment sewing is so finicky and so like fussy and fine and that kind of thing. And I don't think I'd have the patience for it. So that's why I don't have any desire to do that. So why?
So it's interesting, and I think you and I have talked about this in the past. I think when you're making a quilt, you're making on a flat surface. You've got a length and a width, right? When you're making a garment, you've got an armhole, you've got a neck hole. So now all of a sudden you're working in, you have something that's going to take shape and not be in flat. You've got 3 dimensions.
Yeah.
So there's always that extra challenge. There's no question. I think the other thing, usually when you're making a garment, believe it or not, there's actually a little bit of wiggle room, because you can play with seam allowances to modify. If you didn't cut something right, oh, well, I'll just cut back the seam allowance in that area and it'll still accomplish the same thing. So you can actually, there is a little bit more wiggle room there. I think with quilting, and I did a class with Eleanor, just the beginner quilt, because I wanted to experience it. I wanted to know, okay, so I don't want to just blankly say I don't never want to do a quilt. So we did that, 2 foot by 4 foot table runner. And I really loved it. I really had a lot of fun with it, because I learned some things that I would never have learned making garments.
Right.
4 feet wide and 2 feet was already too much for me to handle. Can't imagine doing a king size or queen size quilt. Like, to me, that would be insane. And to just, not that it's the same thing, but at the facility that we're going to have this workshop with Ron, they have a big giant screen at the front of the room, and they've asked to make a backdrop. So basically just curtains.
Right.
They approached me and I made the curtains. And I'm going to tell you, I've never worked with so much fabric in my life, because it's 12 feet by 15 feet. And then of course you have 2 times fullness or whatever.
Yeah.
I was literally out in the backyard on the deck trying to spread this fabric out. You know what it's like trying to do a 12-foot French seam? It was just crazy. So I find it's so large and I become overwhelmed. And that's why I'm not as interested in that area.
Yeah, I can see that, but it seems that there are quilters who do garments as well, and vice versa too. But I'm not one of them, because to me, I like it flat. I have a little problem. I'm spatially challenged or whatever.
And I'm sure, I think, you've probably set yourself up in such a way to be able to work through those issues of the size and what have you.
Well, yeah.
And I'm sure if I was to be that passionate about it, I would do the same thing. But yeah, exactly. My space is designed for garments, and that's what I love. So
yeah, with that. Okay, so my last question for you then is, what is it? Oh yeah, if anybody who's new, I mean, you're new, but you're not new. I mean, that's the amazing part about all of this. But what advice would you give to somebody who wants to get into garment sewing?
There's a few things I'd say. First of all, don't be afraid to try. Don't be afraid. I mean, and start slowly. But probably one of the biggest things I learned very early was buy extra fabric, buy cheap fabric and buy extra fabric. And don't consider mistakes as failures, but rather learning experiences, because it really is by making mistakes that you that you do learn and you perfect your skill. There's sometimes early on I'd be making a shirt and I would know right away when I made a mistake, and very clearly I would just throw it out and start another one because I know how I made my mistake and I know how to fix it. So that's probably the number one piece of advice, is that, you know, don't be afraid to try. And there's so much support out there. And I think if there's one thing that I love about this craft, whether it's quilters, whether it's garment makers, whether it's anybody in the sewing world, I find my experience has been that everybody is so supportive and they're so encouraging and there's so much help and guidance that you're never alone. It's not a cutthroat thing where somebody won't share information. No, everybody just wants to share and help it and share the love.
Yep, so I have found that too. And also, when you talk about making mistakes, we don't call it mistakes. We call them customizations.
There's a good word.
With it. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much for this.
No,
and yeah, any last words?
No, not really. Again, I would say to anybody that that is looking into this type of a hobby that, you know, you can do as little or as much as you want. My daughter bought a machine for $200 and now she's insanely addicted. So it, you know, the $200 was just to see, well, maybe I'll like it, maybe I won't.
Yeah.
And now she's like head over heels. So, but it wasn't a huge investment. But
no, you don't have to make a huge investment if we're just first trying. It's once you got the bug, then you're going to be making the investments with it. That's for sure. Yeah. So, well, thank you so much for this. And really stay on. Yeah, do stay on the line for a few minutes. I'm just going to stop the recording, but just once again, thank you so much. And you know, the thing is, I learned a lot from what you've already said on here. As a quilter, I don't know that much about the garment world. You've filled me in on that, and I'm sure that a lot of my viewers that are going to watch this, it'll be the same for them as well. So thank you for that.
Anything else, if you know, if I've answered questions or shed some light, then that's great. And by all means, anybody wants to reach out, you know, they can contact me through you, and I'm more than happy to help. Yeah,
and that, yes, for sure. So thank you so much for that, and I'm just going to say goodbye to you now.
Bye now.